studied it, and in 1962 adopted the plan, resulting in the establishment of what was later to be called the Tabung Haji.
Thank you for your patience. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi and a very good morning. Board of Directors Universiti Malaya yang berbahagia Profesor Dato' Insinyur Dr. Muhammad Hamdi Abdul Syukur, the Vice Chancellor Universiti Malaya, yang berbahagia Profesor Dr. Sabri Musa, the Acting Deputy Vice Chancellor in Research and Innovation Universiti Malaya, yang berusaha Dr. Rohana Jani, the Acting Director Ungku Aziz Center for Development Studies, distinguished guests yang berbahagia Tan Sri Dr. Zeti Aziz, the Co-Chair Board of Governors Asia School of Business, yang berbahagia distinguished Professor Dr. Samsul Amri Baharudin from the Institute of Ethnic Studies, Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia, our honorable speakers, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Ungku Aziz Center International Conference on Poverty, Inequality and Development, UACIC 2021, Development Through the Lens of Professor Ungku Aziz, a man ahead of his time. Ladies and gentlemen, the UACIC 2021 second day is now in session. Today's keynote session under the theme Poverty, Inequality and Development, and the topic is Fleshing Out the Olive on Income Polarization in China. It is my great pleasure to invite Yang Berbahagia Distinguished Professor Dr. Raja Rasya to chair today's keynote session by Yang Berbahagia Professor Dr. Martin Rabayon. Please welcome.
Thank you, Chair, for the introduction. As we celebrate the contributions of one of Malaysia's greatest intellectuals, whom we call in a very passionate way, Pak Ungku. I'd like to thank the organizers, especially Ungku Aziz Center for Development Studies, the Faculty of Economics, or now it's called the Faculty of Business and Economics, Universiti Malaya as well, for giving me the opportunity to moderate this very important session, keynote speech to be delivered by very eminent speaker, Professor Martin Rabayon. Studies on poverty have come a long way since Simon Kuznets found an inverted relationship using longitudinal studies on developed countries between income inequality and economic growth. But of course, it also was the basis, I believe, it laid the foundations for Rostow's trickling down theory of development in 1960. Subsequently, Sudhiranan and Gary Fields did not find any of these relationships looking at world data and perhaps more robust econometric techniques. Then we have about the same time the contribution of Gabriel Palmer, who found using deciles, the ratio 10% top income earners over 40% bottom income earners, to be quite interesting in understanding poverty as well as inequality, which quite a number of people use. Then we have, of course, Thomas Piketty from his work on capital, where he actually looks at the ratio between wealth and income. He found, of course, alarmingly increasing widening of that, worsening of that in the 19th century and until the early 20th century. Then, of course, that inequality going down sharply and subsequently rising again strongly from 1980. Now then, of course, James Galbraith adds to that by mentioning the income inequality of many developed countries having increased over the last 6 decades, especially so with the US and the UK, including indicators like Bates per patient population ratio to a whole range of other social indicators that show a relative improvement of countries like Japan, China, Korea, Taiwan against these countries. Then we had this 2019 Nobel laureate, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, who used this Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab with experiments to look at the real aspects of what actually happens with the poor, working with them, largely based on India. And of course, it's got a parallel in terms of its interdisciplinarity, where they make the point that people who are poor also think they are also rational. And there are many other obligations in relation to change, in a way quite similar to what Amartya Sen uses his capability approach with its very philosophical lenses. And I think a lot of Latin Americans have come up with that understanding. And in fact, it's the basis for inclusivity in understanding development. people like Paulo Freire, Peter Berger, and others. Then we have our first chairholder here, and Professor Martin is the next one, Jeffrey Sachs. His famous book, End of Poverty, 2005. Well, of course, with the absorption of that in the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, the effort to seek an end to absolute poverty by 2030. I'm not sure if they're dealing with that, but of course, he mentions that to be done with contributions from the wealthy countries and with effective allocation of those resources, of that wealth. Now we have, by the last holder, Professor Martin Rebellion, holding the Professor Unko as his chair. I suppose his paper is going to deliver will be on China. Let me get to that now. He is the inaugural holder. Professor Martin Rebellion is the inaugural holder of the Edmund Valiani Chair of Economics at the Georgetown University since 2013. He was a research director at the World Bank before that. Among his outstanding books, publications, I see, and I've looked at this book, The Economics of Poverty, History, Measurement, and Policy by Oxford University Press in 2016. And of course, his very interesting articles, including when he was holding the chair that I read from the World Development, that I often quote in my works on poverty. And I see a parallel because he's very much often using not just statistical instruments, but he's very empirical and very evidence-based in the way he handles things, in a way bringing a link to the Sarong Index and many other instruments that Pak Unku himself devised. And of course, that time, imagine how he was trying to measure poverty at a time when we did not have a profound statistics department in East Malaysia, for example, by fishermen. And he looked at it in relation to children above 5, the number of sarongs in the index. That's how the Sarong Index came out. But today, Professor Martin Rebellion, I'm glad to see you here, will be speaking on fleshing out the olives on income polarization in China. The floor is yours, Professor Martin.
Thank you very much, Raja. You can hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Great. I hope everybody can as well. It's really a great honor to be giving this talk. I remember sitting in my office at when I first arrived at the end of 2018. And there were 7 volumes of Unko Aziz's collected works. And actually, I started reading them. I'd heard about him, knew about him, but I'd never read that much. But there was 30 years difference in our age, and things have changed a lot in that period. But what was really remarkable is how much I thought we had in common. A number of issues, the importance of agricultural and rural development, the continuing importance to poverty reduction, in ways that I'm going to illustrate with this talk today. I say today for you, it's tonight for me. I'm in Washington. I'll survive another hour, hopefully, but late at night. But one of the things that, a more subtle theme that I saw in his writings that I very much, I wish we'd met and I wish we'd talked. I think we would have had a lot in common. But one of the more subtle themes was his obvious realization, which came to me, but much after, of the importance of measurement to policy, but the measurement to public action, to the awareness of citizens about things like poverty, something I've devoted my whole professional career to. And I think we would have had, that was just maybe the strongest connection. And that's something I'm going to illustrate today. I'm not going to talk about Malaysia. As Raja mentioned, I've written a couple of papers on Malaysia, a 2-part paper in World Development that came out recently, which I did at the center. I'm going to turn to China. One of the striking things, when you think about political leaders all over the world, it's notable that they seem to care, at least in rhetoric. They seem to agree, everybody seems to agree that eliminating poverty is an objective. But there isn't much else they agree on in terms of distribution of income. You think about it, we don't have a consensus around inequality. Maybe we'll never will. I mean, it's not like poverty where we would expect it to go to zero. Inequality is not something that should be zero, I would argue, but we can discuss that later if you like. Anyway, mid-August, this paper emerged as a result of a speech by Xi Jinping, President of China. And for the first time in my knowledge or memory, we had a leader of not just a country, but the biggest in the world, articulating a distributional objective, which was not poverty reduction. He's actually argued in favor of poverty reduction extensively before. It was something else. And that's what I'm going to explain. And I'm going to try and measure, I'm going to try and explain what he was talking about as best I can. And I'm going to try and measure it, and I'm going to try and see how China is doing with respect to this new distributional goal, which is new. It's quite different to anything we've ever talked about before. So it really does need some attention. Okay, I'm going to switch to the PowerPoint. Sorry to say that I'm one of these people who can't give a talk without PowerPoint. Okay, everybody see that fine? Roger, is it looking all right?
Yes, clear. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, let me also turn on my pen. I like my pen. And let me just make this a bit bigger. There we go. Okay, this is based on a very recent working paper where I just put out with my long-term collaborator, Xiaohua Chen, now at Ximen University in China. And the paper is called Fleshing Out the Olive, ? On income polarization in China. So a bit of motivation first, then I'm going to talk about the data, then I'm going to try and explain to you what this fleshing out the olive is all about. What on earth am I talking about? Well, in fact, what on earth is Xi Jinping talking about? Then I'm going to link up to urban bias and policies in ways that really complete the cycle, going right back to Unko Aziz. Then I'm going to conclude. Okay, what are we talking about, fleshing out the olive? Well, this is the speech that, very prominent speech that President Xi Jinping gave in China, where he talked about the need for an olive-shaped distribution structure of large, middle, and small ends. So you'll see this little picture here that you're going to see repeatedly in my talk, an olive. What he's saying, he wants to flesh out the olive. He wants to fatten it, squeezing the top and squeezing the bottom. Now, it might sound a bit trivial, but it's not at all. So first question, what on earth does that mean? Second, how are we going to measure it? No point announcing some new goal if we can't measure it and see how we're doing. And lastly, and the most difficult question, what are the potential trade-offs here? What might we have to give up? What might China have to give up? And of course, if China gives something up, the world gives it up. What might we have to give up to flesh out the olive, to do this? It's important to note that identifying trade-offs is a really difficult thing. We have observational data. The data reflect past choices. They reflect past trade-offs, and they reflect shocks. And there's what we call in econometrics the deep identification problem. I'm going to try and shortcut a lot of that just by looking at the historical evidence and draw out some correlations that are at least suggestive. This is going to be more like thick description than causal analysis, but I think the thick description here tells us quite a lot. Two key questions: is rising polarization associated with economic growth? Let me wait for my definition of polarization. Would success against polarization stall poverty reduction? So why do we care? Well, that's a good question, actually. Here we've got China, a huge rate of growth, quadrupling GDP per capita in 40 years, amazing poverty reduction since the reform started in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping. But those gains came with rising inequality. And as I'm going to show you, they came with rising polarization. There are ethical concerns about that, concerns about unequal opportunities, and a huge current issue in China. There are also reasons why these changes we're seeing in distribution are not just ethical concerns, they're also instrumentally important to other goals, including poverty reduction and economic growth going forward. There are issues about how incomplete markets, especially credit market failures, interact with the growth process to influence its distributional outcomes. A range of issues going back a long time in economics. Inequalities in human development, another set of issues, especially related to children. The intergenerational reproduction of inequality and poverty is a huge issue. And I'm going to link that, not very deeply, but I'll certainly try to make the link to this concept of polarization, and eroding social and political consensus in policy and public goods. And this is a very important one. I live in a country, the United States, where we've seen considerable erosion in social and political consensus. We're seeing a bifurcation, you could say polarization, in political discourse and policy discourse, which is stalling progress, in my view. What we're going to do, I'm going to do in this talk, based on the work I've done with Xiao Chen, and Xiao has done a lot of the data work for this paper. I'm going to try and use the historical record assembled from our archival assessment of distributions back to roughly back to a bit after Deng Xiaoping. One of the problems in China is that we didn't have household survey data in the old regime. Your reporting was all through firms. There were little scatterings of surveys over the decades. But the beginning of what we recognize as a modern household survey, and actually quite a credible survey, emerged in the wake of Deng Xiaoping's reforms. And there's another example of how data connects to economic change, but not in the way we always think about it. There are a number of issues in the data. One of the fundamental problems, which is also shared with Malaysia, is the lack of access to the unit record data from the national surveys. China and Malaysia are among the relatively few countries today where the public, the citizens, don't have access to microdata. And of course, we're in a world now where we do everything normally with microdata. We've got huge computing power. We've got analytic abilities that nobody even dreamt about, that I'm sure Unko Aziz, when he was in his prime, could never imagine. I'm going to use time series tabulations, archival time series tabulations, going back as far as I can from the new wave of surveys that emerged after Deng Xiaoping's reforms began, building all this up as best we can from this historical record and as consistently as we can. And there's all kinds of problems in the data and things we have to worry about. And we've got papers on just each one of these problems and talking about them. And I'm not going to go into it in much detail. One of the issues, this actually reflects our own interactions with the National Bureau of Statistics in China. When I first started going to China in the early 1990s, I was appalled. I thought the National Bureau of Statistics was doing a good job in its urban household survey and was doing quite a good job in its rural household survey, but they were different surveys. They were not fully integrated. And this was a problem. And I pushed hard on that. And eventually they became integrated, but it took a long time. Another issue is the design of the sample frame. Normally, we use street addresses. We design a sample frame based on a census or an updated census. They weren't doing that. They were basing their sampling on the registration of households and what's called the byproduct of what's called the HUCO system. This is vaguely like an internal passport system. Not quite. It's more a restriction on migration. It's something that basically increases the cost of migration for rural migrants if you don't have access to urban services as a destination. But they were basing their sampling on the registration system. So there was what was called the floating population that was left out. We've come to view that this has probably led to, if you exclude the migrants, you overestimate inequality. So the surveys prior to this change in the survey design, prior to 2013, we think they almost certainly have overestimated inequality. Okay, cost of living and price indices, a bunch of issues here. We're following our past methods, 37% allowance of the cost of living difference based on prices facing poor people in urban areas and rural areas. We use separate price indices between urban and rural areas. We'd love to do this in a deeper subnational way, but it's not feasible as yet. There are also some problems we can't fix, but we will eventually. Okay, distributional measures. There are 4 that are going to be prominent in this talk. Polarization, and here I'm going to use the Foster-Wolfson Polarization Index, which I'm going to explain to you because it's probably new. On inequality, I'm going to use the famous Gini Index, and not so famous, but actually much better, tile index, the mean log deviation. On social welfare, I'm going to use the equally famous Szynski-Sen index. On poverty, the equally famous Foster-Gear-Thorbecke measures. I'm going to come and explain the details of that as we move along. In building the data up, we've used parameterized Lorentz curves, the best functional forms we can fit to this archival data, these tabulations we assemble. We do that separately, for urban and rural areas, building that up consistently. It's actually quite tricky how to aggregate Lorentz curves, but we need to do that for the Gini index and the polarization index, not for the tile index that I talked about. That's actually much easier. And we use the implicit shares for urban and rural populations from the surveys. Okay, so what is this about? Fleshing out the olive. First thing, polarization or inequality. Are they the same thing? In theory, they are definitely not the same thing. And I'm going to show you just how different they can be. I'm going to define, following the literature of Foster Wolfson in particular, I'm going to define a less polarized distribution as one that has a higher share of the population within some interval containing the population's current median. So it's really the spread relative to the median. The polarization, we think of the median as a reference, and the more we spread density away from the median, the more polarized the society is. So think about this. We've got distributions A and B. Yeah. These are frequency distributions of income, giving you on the vertical axis percentage of people with each income level, or poorest, richest. This is artificial. I just created this to illustrate the concept. So the distribution that B, that's the orange rather than the yellow, is more polarized. What does that mean? Well, look at it. What we've done in creating distribution B, we sort of moved density away from the middle. Yeah, so we've kind of hollowed out the middle. That's the concept we're after. Fleshing out the olive is depolarizing, moving the density toward the middle. So this is a natural concept. I mean, obviously, Xi Jinping didn't talk about it, but it's a natural economic concept, and we're just linking that to his speech and this new trajectory for China to try to provide something to measure. Okay, I'm addressing these questions. What do the data tell us about income polarization? How has it evolved in the post-reform period? Importantly, has China's economic growth and poverty reduction come with rising polarization? I actually think that's what Xi Jinping thinks. I'm guessing. I think he thinks it's been a cost. Polarization has been a cost of economic growth and poverty reduction. I'm actually going to argue that's not the case. What role has been played by population urbanization and the urban-rural differences in real income? And here's where the Ungo Aziz themes that I read about in that collected work, those collected works, why that's going to come back. Well, I think you've all, at some point, you've seen a Lorentz curve. Here's a Lorentz curve, giving the cumulative share of income held by the poorest P% of the population. Okay, and this is the workhorse of standard inequality measurement. And the Gini index, the famous Gini index, is the area between the Lorentz curve and the diagonal as a proportion of the area under the diagonal. So if you think of the area between the diagonal, well, obviously the diagonal is when there's no inequality. Everybody has the same income. The actual Lorentz curve is the curve itself here, what you see, right? The inequality is intuitively going to be how much that Lorentz curve shifts out relative to the diagonal. And a natural measure of that is the Gini index, which is essentially the area A in this diagram divided by the area A plus B. Well, obviously the area A plus B is 1/2, right? So the Gini index is just twice the area A. So that's hopefully a refresher for most of you. What on earth is this polarization concept? Okay, well, it's really very different. Let me just move my faces so I can see better. So here's the same Lorentz curve. Now I've drawn a tangent to that Lorentz curve at the median. So here's the median. Obviously, the median is going to be that's not the median, that is the 50th percentile, the midpoint of the distribution in terms of percentiles. So polarization is really about, if you think of inequality as this area, yeah, the Gini index, what we're measuring in polarization is essentially this area. what we're trying to see, yeah, is how much we're seeing a spread of incomes relative to the median. And with a bit of algebra, you can back out this formula for it, which depends on the mean of the distribution, the median of the distribution, obviously that's going to be crucial, and this area correction factor. Okay, I'm going to talk about trade-offs with other goals. So that's my concept of polarization, following Foster and Wolfson. Instead, talking about social welfare, so one obvious question is, if you depolarize China, are you going to have, is social welfare going to increase? Well, actually, that's not obvious. So here, as an obvious starting point, I've used the Shczyński-Sen index. The Shczyński-Sen index is a very famous index going back to Amartya Sen's work in the 1970s. It's just 1 minus the Gini index times the mean. So the polarization index that I just showed you, you can easily show is just this thing. Twice the difference between the Shczyński-Sen social welfare index and the mu-L, which is the mean income of those below the median. And M again is the median. All right, very simple. An immediate implication of that is an increase in social welfare by this measure will be polarizing. An increase will be polarizing unless it comes with sufficient gain to either the overall median or the mean income of the lower half, or obviously both. As social welfare gains that stem solely from gains among the top half of the incomes will be polarizing. So you see, wow, we just split a major concept of social welfare from this concept of polarization. So we established the possibility of a trade-off. What about poverty reduction? Well, here it's actually pretty straightforward. We can easily get trade-offs. A growth process that is poverty reducing but only benefits, say, the upper half of the distribution will be polarizing with a very high poverty line. It could reduce poverty but increase polarization. A distribution neutral growth process where all incomes grow at the same rate will leave the polarization index unchanged. And if you think about poverty, if we do a mean preserving income transfers from someone just below the poverty line to the poorest person, we will reduce poverty by the Foster-Greer-Thorbeck squared poverty index, but increase polarization. What about inequality? Well, let's go back to my picture on the Lorentz curve and the polarization index. Here's an obvious example where we reduce inequality but increase polarization. What if we redistribute incomes among the top half? In other words, we do that. We turn the Lorentz curve above 0.5, we turn it into that red straight line. Inequality falls, obviously. We've certainly reduced the Gini index, you can see that. But polarization rises. We've obviously got a more polarized society. You can see that area has increased. This area at the bottom here has remained exactly the same, but the area above the top has increased. So increased polarization but reduced inequality. Okay, we can make many other arguments, and the paper elaborates this at some length. I just want to turn to the evidence because actually there's going to be a lot of surprises here. There was the least surprises for me, and motivated by what I've said already, you're probably going to see why. Okay, what do we get? So assembling all this data back as carefully as we can, and you know, believe me, this could be improved. I've given you the broad picture here. Now, I've given you a new concept here, the fractionalization index, which is really just a measure of the extent to which people live in different sectors, where sectors are urban or rural. So really, it's the how much do people live in different sectors, and how does that change? So fractionalization, I don't think it's a hugely interesting concept in this context, but it's particularly interesting in the context of work on inequalities and conflict in societies. More fractionalized societies tend to be more conflictual and so on. But put that all aside, what do we see for the inequality and polarization indices? Well, the first observation, the blue line, this one here, sorry for my bad drawing, the blue line is the Gini index. The orange line here is the polarization index. Gini, G, polarization. Look at that. Well, we can tell all kinds of stories about how they may move in different directions, and one goes up, one could go down. But over time, they're co-moving very strongly. I also give you the urban and rural breakdown, a couple of observations. Rural polarization exceeds urban polarization. Some signs of convergence, but not they're there between urban and rural areas in terms of polarization. Another thing, look at the overall curvature. If you fit a quadratic function to this, both parameters are highly significant. We have what here you might call a Kuznets curve. In another paper, we argue it is definitely not a Kuznets curve. And the vast literature in China on the so-called Lewis-Kuznets turning point around 2010, the fact that inequality is falling since 2010, but was generally rising before. But we argue in this other paper that's all wrong. It's not a Kuznets curve at all. It doesn't have anything to do with the Kuznets process. But I'm going to come back to why that is the case. Polarization curves, this is a neat idea. We can take, instead of thinking about a particular measure, we can just plot this thing. Here I plotted you the difference between incomes at each percentile, it's the quantile function, and the median normalized by the median. So here it's just telling you the absolute value of that gap between each income level and the median, normalized by the median. How's that changed over time? Well, first observation, we go back to 1984. First thing, 1984 to 2009, we saw a huge increase in polarization coming from the top of the distribution. I don't think too many people will be surprised by that. Not that much happening at the bottom half, but a huge increase in polarization coming from rising top incomes relative to the median. And then a retreat from that. In fact, the gains in polarization that I showed you here since 2010 are coming entirely from attenuating top incomes. So in some sense, what Xi Jinping is talking about as the future is in fact the past as well. This has been going on for a while. Social welfare and polarization. Well, here's the Shczyzinski-Sen index, the blue line here. No surprise. Big increase in social welfare. In other words, by this measure of social welfare, we're seeing the rise in inequality has not been sufficient to outweigh the gains in the mean and assure rising social welfare. And of course, falling absolute poverty came with that. Is it orange? I guess it's orange, this line. I'm not sure what color it is to you. The orange line is a renormalization of the Shczyzinski-Sen index, renormalized by the median. That green line at the bottom is the mean of the poorest half relative to the median. So the polarization index is going to be the difference between these two lines, right? That puts things in a bit of perspective here. First, if you renormalize the social welfare by the median instead of the mean, so you just multiply by the median divided by the mean, multiply by the mean divided by the median, then this amazing progress is suddenly not so amazing. Polarization average income. Well, this picture, I'm going to argue, is very deceptive. So this looks like a kind of Kuznets curve for polarization, that as average income rose, we saw polarization rise, not monotonically, but after a while it started to fall. This is interesting. I'm going to come back to that because there are various stages of these turning points in both polarization and inequality in China that I'm going to try and explain. And that's where I'm going to make this link back to Ungo Aziz's arguments 50 years ago. First observation, well, is this what we should be worried about? Should we be thinking? The Economist magazine wrote something about this just after Xi Jinping's speech, saying, is China willing to give up growth for reducing polarization? And I think the subtext a bit in China now is that you may need to do that. The problem with that is that I don't believe this correlation, this kind of nonlinear relationship, is actually very deep or very structural. I think it's potentially spurious, in fact. And the one way you see that is by estimating a time series regression of the log of the polarization index against its own lag value, the log of the mean, and the lagged log of the mean. I'm not going to do higher lags. I don't really have enough observations, but it points immediately, if you do look to the parameter restriction tests on this, it points immediately to a relationship between the changes in polarization and the changes in the mean. So that's saying, let's turn the question essentially into allowing also for a time trend. Let's turn the question to whether the changes in polarization are correlated with the changes in the mean, i.e. the log of the mean, which means the growth rate. So in the periods of more rapid growth, did we see more rapid polarization? And the answer is definitely not. In fact, the correlation is negative. The periods when we saw higher growth rates, we saw less increase, lower rates of increase in the polarization index. That, we argue in the paper, is itself may be deceptive. We do a bunch of outlier tests and influence statistics, and it doesn't look robust to me. I basically come to this last conclusion. Growth rates and polarization changes in China have been essentially orthogonal. Well, this is, you're wondering, well, what is driving all this? Well, I'm going to come back to that. One of the drivers, the intermediate drivers, is this variable. Here I plotted you the growth rate in the polarization index. I plotted for you the growth rate in the polarization index on the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, the growth in the ratio of urban mean to rural mean income in China. These are both growth rates. There's no sign that this is a spurious correlation in terms of in time series analysis terms. This is pretty strong. Correlation of 0.83 in the first differences of these two variables. For the time series analysis folk, this is we can throw a bunch of other time series tests and methods at this, but it comes out pretty strongly. So what's going on? What we've seen is it's not really about overall economic growth. It's about the gap between urban and rural mean incomes. So that's seems to be the true causative factor. When we look at those correlations, they're really strong with Foster-Wolfson index and polarization, the Gini index with the tile index I mentioned, mean log deviations. Let's just think about it this way. Go back to that picture. Over here, I've given you the ratio of urban mean to rural mean and the national mean log deviation, which is an inequality index with actually lots of great properties, much better than the Gini index, but it's actually a natural measure, inequality measure, if we're talking about this issue. Basically, 88% of the variance in inequality, overall inequality in China, is accountable to one thing: the gap between urban mean income and rural mean income. That is quite astonishing. That seems to be very robust every way I look at that. So what we're seeing here is a continuing of the product. The inequality rise is essentially a continuing product of an urban bias in Chinese policymaking, which I've argued in another paper. It goes back to 1950s. It goes back to the Maoist regime. Despite all the rhetoric of Mao, it was definitely evident. The Hukou system has reinforced this bias by increasing the cost of migration, the service inaccessibility facing rural migrants. And in fieldwork over decades in China, I've seen this firsthand repeatedly. The urban bias in public spending and the migration restrictions is deeply rooted in China's political economy, even back to the Maoist period. This was compounded by geographic biases in policymaking, favoring coastal areas versus inland areas. But it's still there, didn't go away. All of this points to the importance of one thing, one set of policies, agrarian policies. Now, when I say it didn't go away, it went away sometimes. There are periods when there were reversals, when the urban bias was greatly attenuated, supported primarily by agricultural policy reforms. And the history of those policies helps us understand every one of the turning points. So let's go back to those turning points. Look at them. There are three. Yeah. I can explain. It's not going to pass causal inference tests because we can't, but I'm going to try and explain every one of those turning points in terms of the historical record on agrarian reforms. The first two are better documented than the third. The first turning point was due to Deng Xiaoping's reforms, which started in agriculture, the household responsibility system. And that was more political economy, I think. It had to start in agriculture because they were scared of another famine, and they'd seen the famine in 1959-61, the worst possibly in human history, under the so-called, ironically called Great Leap Forward. Deng Xiaoping's household responsibility system abandoned collective agriculture to return to peasant farming. And this was possibly the largest land reform we've ever seen, because virtually all agricultural land, which had been under socialist agriculture, was fairly equitably allocated, at least within communes. Between communes, a different story, because you couldn't move very easily. But within communes, we saw a massive equalizing distribution of the main non-labor asset of the poorest stratum of China's society. This created strong incentives for individual production. Those threats of impending famine were soon gone. Naturally, it also reduced the urban-rural gap in mean incomes. The second turning point, now this one I think is pretty well understood. I'm sure everybody's heard about this. There was that second turning point. Not so well understood, and the third one not at all well understood, but that second one was actually dismantling a feature of Deng Xiaoping's household responsibility system, which was fairly negative from the point of view of poor people. So in a funny way, Deng clearly understood that if you give people the marginal product of their labor, they will work harder, and farmers did that. So under the household responsibility system, as it says, the household responsibility system, you produced however much you liked, right, given the market prices, but there was this inframarginal tax. So in a sense, Deng, I believe, understood that peasants didn't like socialist agriculture, no great surprise, I suspect, but also he was worried that they wouldn't be responsive enough to market signals. And it wouldn't solve his problem of sufficient food supply to urban areas. So he put this inframarginal tax on them, which basically said you have to sell a certain amount of your product, a quota, less than the amount you produce, but a quota at a price that was set below the market price. So the difference between the market price and the procurement price, the price set by the government for procuring this quota of food, that difference is a tax. It's not called a tax in China, but believe me, that's a tax. What that happened was getting rid of it. Oh, I'm sorry. What happened there? Oh, dear. Okay, sorry. Getting that second reform was essentially getting rid of that tax. What they did is let the procurement price rise close to the market price. Look at the effect on inequality. The third reform, which is less well understood, was a sequence of reforms starting around 2000 for a number in a sequence that lasted quite a while, which is all about reducing taxes in other ways on agriculture. These are called the explicit taxes, or I call them the explicit taxes. Having eliminated the implicit tax, they start on the agricultural taxes. They also start on price support for food staples. And the poor benefited enormously from this, given that the taxes and transfers were very regressive. Okay, in a nutshell, we've not got a very complicated story here, but it also points to a lot of new challenges for China, and I'm going to summarize those as best I can and have time for discussion. The hukou system. Long time now, I've been hearing, the party congresses, the Communist Party, at least at the center, trying to get rid of the hookah system, informally or formally. They've never much liked it, I think. Or way back they did, but they can't get rid of it. It's really difficult. Well, eventually I think it will go. Large cities that still have a hookah system, it's alive and well. There are a whole bunch of reforms, particularly since in 2014. They've eliminated hookah in many of the smaller cities, but it's alive and well in the large ones. Long-standing inequalities in social policies come with the hookah system, and huge new emerging education inequalities. Education attainments now are highly unequal in China, particularly between urban and rural areas, very nicely documented by Rosell and Hell. And the earlier book by Knight and Song that I referenced there also contains a lot of nice stuff on this. Well, not so nice, really. It's a pretty alarming story. Now China has, you go back to 1978, China had a relatively equal education system, relatively, I mean, compared to, say, India. But now we've got a very unequal education system, a highly expensive, highly competitive, elitist education system, a lot of forces for inequality increase, and particularly inequality of opportunity going forward. And this continuing problem of limited access, such limited access to the rural population to social policies. It's changing. I mean, the famous Dibao program started in urban China. It took quite a while before a rural Dibao was invented. This Dibao is Mandarin slang for minimum income. This is a major social policy reform to try to replace what was the iron rice bowl from the previous regime. We're also seeing rising concentrations of capital in China and highly unequal returns. I'm going to conclude with just one slide. First, fleshing out the olive can be interpreted as depolarization, as I've argued. This can be readily measured. It's not that difficult. You could do it better than we've done, probably, particularly if you had access to the unit record data, the micro data. Polarization has been rising. In that sense, there's a general trend upwards, but with a major turning point around 2010, coming, as I said, primarily from this attenuation of median normalized incomes at the top. I find no convincing evidence to support this idea that polarization came from economic growth, at least in the simplest possible interpretation of that argument. I find strong evidence of a very robust predictor of the changes in inequality and polarization, which is the gap, the urban-rural income gap, which is still huge in China. It's largest I've seen anywhere. In large part for China, these turning points and these changes we've seen reflect how economic policy, particularly agrarian policy, has influenced the urban-rural divide. And there, of course, you can see the link to Ungo Aziz's work in Malaysia. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Martin, for this very interesting, very articulate lecture. I enjoyed very much listening to it. Let me just make a few points before opening the discussion to the floor. The first, I mean, obviously you're making a case, robust evidence that the normal assumption, which is also taken by Xi Jinping, that polarization is a consequence of continued rapid economic growth. And of course, you're providing evidence, and at the same time, you're making a case that's happening because of the rural-urban income gap. And you also provide historical evidence from the time reform started in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping, and subsequently the 1918 implicit tax, I might call that, you're calling it a tax. Well, I shall not take the shine of this very interesting lecture that you've given. I think the audience is waiting there to really ask you questions. Thank you again, Martin.
Thank you very much. I'll just stop my screen. Okay.
Yes, yes, I'm waiting for questions. While waiting, it's interesting. Most, including myself, I wasn't very aware that there was privatization of land in communes. That's new information for me. Thank you. I haven't got this any questions yet. I hope we can get some questions.
Don't be shy. I find Zoom doesn't encourage students and participants to ask questions. Well, I have hundreds of students, and I'm always begging them to ask me a question on Zoom. So let me just beg to you. Questions, please.
I found the lecture very clear, so I'm not sure why no questions yet.
Well, clear doesn't preclude questions.
Of course, if everybody feels satisfied, they've got whatever they're looking for, then we don't need questions then.
I think they're just a bit shy, like my students and many past participants. So,
But just while waiting,
Yeah.
did you make any attempt to look at these same indexes that you've used, especially the 4, in different regions in China, meaning?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay.
No. It's sort of somewhere in the schedule of things to do.
Okay, that's one question, I believe.
In the chat, we've got something. Oh, we got 2 in the chat.
And anonymous. I'm supposed to look at the Q&A. Let me get to the Q&A. Oh yeah, it's in the Q&A. You can of course see that. Would you agree, Martin? Would you agree that development and now re-emerging industrial policy should not fail to include rural and agricultural industry?
Broadly, yeah. I think that's why, when you start, why would you ever exclude a huge sector for developing countries? Of course not.
And it's followed by,
Yeah.
Would you have a view on how Malaysia has done in this area, given the large emphasis on export commodity agriculture and not so much on surplus trade of agri-products involving urban communities?
No, I have not looked at that for Malaysia. Others in the audience probably have a better idea of the answer to that question. All my work on Malaysia has been really on the new economic policy and whether it was a success or not in terms of poverty and inequality, which is a kind of difficult question, but I have not thought about that question. Sorry.
Okay, I think I don't see the list of questions up there anymore.
I'm not seeing any open questions at this point in the Q&A.
Yeah, that's another one that's come up. Is the distribution of wealth an important determinant of income inequality? Any data on that?
It's a hugely important determinant of income inequality, yeah. Incomes are roughly the return to wealth. So if wealth is unequally distributed, incomes tend to be unequally distributed. When I say income is a return to wealth, it's wealth in some general sense, which includes human capital as well as physical capital and financial capital. But so that's unavoidable. That if you have almost unavoidable, highly unequal distribution of wealth, you're going to have a highly unequal distribution of income. What we see in practice is that wealth is far more unequally distributed than income. That's no great surprise.
Yes, Martin, we have another question here.
Yes.
Other than looking at rural-urban bias, do you agree that we should also focus on gender biases? I'm not sure how data will come in addressing poverty and income inequality.
Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah.
How can I disagree with that?
Okay.
I'm not going to say anything about relative importance because I can't. I also think, like ethnic inequalities and racial inequalities, I don't think gender inequalities should be compartmentalized into discussions of income inequality or wealth inequality. They're relevant, of course, but it's just one aspect. But there's a more important point that when we think about if you do decompositions of income inequality, for example, or earnings inequality by things like gender, you'll find that most of the inequality is within genders, not between genders. But that's completely trivializes gender inequality. a small difference in earnings for the same work between genders is very offensive morally, and I would argue for the good of the society as a whole, it's a problem. So I'd argue that, yes, I agree it's important, but in some sense, that's not the issue, really. And also that gender inequalities are in spaces that we haven't talked about. I mean, I focused on income polarization here, but of course, that's just one aspect of how we evaluate the distribution of well-being in a society. I think it's an important aspect, but it's only one. Now, clearly, when we look at gender inequalities, we've got to think of things like the allocation of time, who does the work at home. We've got to think of the propensity for people to escape poverty by their own effort. We've got to think about vulnerability to risk. All of these things, I think, are gender biased. We've seen a lot of evidence on that.
I just have a follow-up question on that, Martin.
Yeah.
While I think that's a very important area to address, gender inequality, but we have incomes by households. Have we been able to disentangle that into gender-based incomes?
We're starting to, yeah, we are. It's two directions in that literature. Mm-hmm. One of them is actually collecting better sub-household living standard data.
Not in Malaysia, I guess. Yeah.
No, not in Malaysia. I'm sorry, but
yeah.
That's looking promising, but it's hard. It's costly in doing the survey. And another promising route has been through building econometric analysis of household behavior on the so-called collective model. So here, instead of thinking of the household as having one utility function as this unitary thing where everybody agrees, you actually model the internal conflicts within a household explicitly, and including allowing for differences in preferences. And you try to back out from what you see in the household aggregates, back out the way income is shared within the household. You can actually do that if you have certain goods within the household that are assigned, like saris. Well, saris are only pretty much only worn by women. Child goods, other goods where they give us a glimpse. And under certain conditions, you can back out the distributional shares within the household based on the household demand for those assigned goods and how that varies with household income. So economists have been working hard on this problem for a long time. We're getting more evidence. We're certainly seeing a lot of evidence now that children, particularly in a lot of the developing world, are not getting what you would consider a fair share, at least particularly in poor households. And that's very difficult. Poor households are facing very difficult decisions about allocation within the household. For example, we've also seen work in the first category that I mentioned. We're seeing a lot of work on looking at nutrition. For example, measuring the BMI by women from demographic and health surveys and looking how that's distributed across households. I've got a paper on that recently in the Review of Economics and Statistics, with others, which points to the serious inequalities that are not captured in our household income aggregates. In fact, the title of that paper is all the work in that paper is for sub-Saharan Africa, and the title of the paper is that 75% of undernourished women and children are not in the poorest 20% of households.
We have, I think the members from the floor have overcome the barrier of shyness. We have quite a few questions now.
Good. Let's go for it.
Let me give you the next one, and we have a few on the way. How do you see the relevance of a wealth tax, which is in the 22 budget, national budget of Malaysia, to reduce polarization?
It certainly can have a role. I'm a little bit skeptical of wealth taxation. It's a difficult thing to do. I would love to make it work, but I think there are problems. I also think about it this way. How do we get to this rising inequality, which we've seen in Malaysia and we're seeing elsewhere? Rising inequality in many dimensions, including incomes and wealth. In a fundamental way, we got to it through, I would argue, past policy mistakes. You can correct those mistakes as a means of reversing this rising trend, or you can introduce a dramatic wealth tax. My hunch would be that the first is the better thing to do. I'd rather see, instead of talking about a new progressive wealth tax, I'd rather see a focus among policymakers on the reasons why we got too much inequality today, including in terms of wealth. I'm not convinced, particularly also given the problems of implementation that I mentioned, I'm not convinced that we should be thinking about it that way. But I'm open to, it's open debate, and it's an ongoing debate. There's another issue. If you think about the rising inequality today, we see in many countries, not all, certainly not all, many countries in Latin America, we're seeing falling inequality in many countries. But if you think about the causes of the rise in inequality, as I said, I'd attribute a lot of that to past policy mistakes. Reversing those mistakes should be the first priority in my view. But also, if you introduce a wealth tax, a permanent wealth tax, is there every possibility you're going to go too far? You've got to get rid of the thing at some point.
Yes, but I think to be more
specific, you manage this process, Roger.
Sorry. To be more specific, I mean, it's not fair to you because I think the audience are focusing on Malaysia, and the wealth tax the government has put up is one that taxes who makes the classified windfall profits, and therefore it really works against the Schumpeterian rent for innovation, and it doesn't get into issues like capital gains tax, taxes on shares, right, on property. But again, I think that will itself call for a different debate. I think let me go to the next question that we have.
Yes.
I mean, what's your take on the new economic policy here? Any advice on that? Should we have right to equal education, financial income, health, access to health? This is from Nurul Alia Yazid. Yeah.
And no question in my mind, of course. There are different kinds of inequality. And I mentioned inequality of opportunity, and the concerns about that in China. When I said at the beginning of my talk that we've got very little consensus around inequality reduction, the one exception I would say is about inequality of opportunity. And I think we can build a consensus socially around the need to equalize opportunity. I don't hear many people saying that unequal opportunities are a good thing. A level playing field for everybody is, I think, something that people consider desirable on ethical grounds. And there, I think we've got an opening for more progressive discussion about how to address inequality. And I'd point to that particularly. It's not that I think that's the only thing that matters, but I think it is something that has a policy salience and a public salience, and something people understand really well, I think, in some deep way, that we can work with.
The next question, Martin.
With regards to poverty reduction in Malaysia, especially in the poor states like Kelantan and Sabah, where poverty rates are in double digits, what should be done? How do we go about it?
It's always going to be, in first order, it's always going to be some combination of, it's basically going to require high rates of economic growth in those places that benefit poor people. It's going to require pro-poor growth. And this is almost trivial, I suspect. And that's what's missing. There's some growth, but it's going to the non-poor. So essentially the main engine, and this has historically always been the case, the main engine for poverty reduction has not been social policies. Social policies come with that growth, and they can support that growth at times, and they can compensate people who are left behind, of course. But the main first order dynamic is getting growth going, but growth that benefits poor people. Now that in a sense, you could say that's almost trivial, and I'd accept that as a criticism. How you do that, extremely hard to generalize. I mean, I've been to Sabah and Kelantan, and I was there beginning of 2020, a bit before the pandemic. And there are a lot of issues I'd put into that, under that heading. How to better manage the refugees, how to better manage migration into these areas, but also issues of agriculture and rural development, issues of credit access, issues that I think are fairly common, but I'd also emphasize that every place, they're kind of different. In all the places where I've worked on poverty reduction, I've never found like some magic bullet that everywhere this works. It's really about figuring out what works in that context with this clear objective in your head about pro-poor growth. Yeah, I'm sidestepping the question a bit, I know, but I warn people against magic bullets too, and ideas that there's universal solutions that'll work everywhere. Economics doesn't tell us that. Good policy analysis never tells us that. It tells us that your successes are built on your ability to recognize the importance of context and what works, including in the political economy sense, in that context.
I like that very much. I'm not one who's into heavy generalizations. Thank you for that point. I don't see any more questions, Martin. Seems
okay.
Like everybody is satisfied. Thanks very much. So I'm sorry to see my organizers have kept you awake for long.
That's all right.
Yeah. Thanks very much. I enjoyed very much listening to you. I learned a lot too. I hope the audience feels the same like me. Thanks again. I pass the
Thank you very much. And thank you all for participating. And I wish I was there in person, but alas not. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Dr. Martin Ravalion and distinguished Professor Dr. Raja Rasya for handling the sessions. Ladies and gentlemen, our next session will start at 10:40 a.m. So let's have a short break and see you at 10:40. Thank you.